Hi, so welcome to this webinar hosted by the Institute of Operational Risk in England and Wales. Hopefully you can see myself and our three panelists on the video. I'll just share a brief kind of introductory presentation, if I may. So hopefully that should come up. Yeah, you can see that. That's good. Thank you, Simon, for letting me know. So this is entitled The Rise of Operational Risk, and I think we've had, I think it's fair in saying it, an unprecedented number of attendees registering, which is brilliant. And I think one of the good things around these webinars that we're able to run. My name is David Goodyear. I've recently become the chair of IOR in England and Wales. I'd just like to take this opportunity to say thank you to Jimmy Hinchliffe, who handed over that chairmanship to me on the 1st of March, who I think had done a really good job, an amazing job for the 4 years prior to that. And this is the first chance I've been able to say thank you to him for that publicly. Just quickly, today's agenda, because I think you'd rather hear from the speakers than my good self. So this is your welcome. We then move on to financial resilience from Dan, Ariane on opportunities for operational risk, and then Simon will conclude the three presentations with the role of the operational risk manager in a world of transboundary crises. After that, all three have agreed to stay for a panel discussion, which is excellent, and it's one of the reasons why we've extended today's session to 90 minutes. And at the end, I'll just give some brief information about the IOR and some of the benefits around that. During the presentations, I think you should be able to submit questions through a questions button, which I will monitor, and then we can field those questions when we get to the panel discussion. So just briefly, I've already mentioned Dan, Ariane, and Simon. Here are their full names, titles. I won't go through their bios. I think they are all excellent speakers. I can say that personally, and I think we'll bring three different points of view to what I think is a very interesting topic today. So at this point, I am going to attempt to bring up Dan's presentation. So I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment. This is a bit like a learner driver, I think, as they move through the gears for the first time. You get to where you want to go to, but it might be a bit clunky along the way. So let's see. And hopefully now I will share Dan's presentation. And if you can see that, Simon, if you could put your thumbs up again, that would be brilliant. Thank you. So Dan, over to you, if I may.
Excellent. Thank you, David. If we could just go to the next slide, I think. Afternoon, everybody. So in a similar session back in November 2019, I said that there were two types of firms, for those of you who were there, but for those who weren't, those who understood the risks that they run and those that don't. And I asked you all to think about which group are you in. Then March 2020 came. The WHO declared a pandemic, and only a few months earlier would have sounded something much more like a scene from a Hollywood movie. The way we live, the way we operate, the risks we're worried about, all changed upside down almost overnight. So why am I saying this when we're still living through it? I'm saying this because it's now more important than ever that we start to look at risk, if we're not already, holistically, rather than silos or as a tick box exercise. So I'm going to change the question. Maybe for 2021 and ahead, the question should change. It's, are you prepared for the unexpected? And so together, this is really important. So firms, consultants, regulators, we need to work together to ensure that the financial system is viable, it's sustainable for the UK and the people who live within the UK, and that there's trust and confidence in financial services. So today I'd like to share with you why financial resilience matters, what we're seeing from our COVID surveys and the steps that have been taken to improve financial resilience, and what we mean by a holistic approach to risk management. Next slide, please, David. So why is financial resilience so important for the conduct regulator? Well, the FCA regulates approximately 49,000 solely regulated firms, which means we prudentially regulate them, and it means we lead on resolution should any of them fail. And there's a very wide variety within that number. This includes financial advisors, insurance intermediaries, SIP operators, non-bank lenders, payments, e-money, investment firms. I'm sure I've missed some along the way. It also includes certain market infrastructure, so exchanges, asset managers, and there are also around 24,000 real economy firms who have a license to sell consumer credit. These firms are not systemic and should be able to fail, as orderly exits and entrants are part of just a well-functioning market. However, we know that significant failures can harm consumers. They can harm the effectiveness of markets and damage the overall confidence in the UK financial system. Therefore, our strategy is to seek to ensure that if firms do fail, they fail in an orderly way, and that harm to consumers or disruption to markets are kept to a minimum wherever possible. So alongside understanding the firm's financial resilience, we also consider which firms could potentially cause the greatest harm in failure. And when I talk about the harm, so for example, that could be through a loss of client assets or segregated funds, failure to pay redress. We're also considering the potential for a loss of access to services, particularly for the vulnerable. And are there threats to competition and the effective functioning of markets? So we can just click, please. So by getting early visibility of potential financial distress in firms, we can intervene faster so that risks are managed and consumers are adequately protected. In response to the crisis, we've been monitoring the effects on firms' financial resilience through four main sources. So capital and liquidity data from the financial resilience surveys. And then we do in-depth analysis of liquidity for a number of the most significant firms. We look at the company's house and creditor payment data for the firms. And then we also have existing regulatory reported data. Through these four sources, we're able to form a regular view on the financial resilience across all of those 49,000 firms. We then look at the supervisory resources and prioritize those based on a combination, as I said, weak resilience, but also the potential for harm in failure. Next slide, please. So what did we observe at the onset of lockdown 1? Well, the survey results show that between February, which pre-lockdown, and during the first lockdown in May, June, the picture was really varied by sector. So for example, we saw an increase in liquidity between the two periods for firms in retail investments, retail lending, and wholesale financial markets, whilst three sectors saw a decrease in available liquidity, so insurance intermediaries, payments, e-money, and investment management. Turning to government support, so figure 19 there on the right, proportionately looking at the retail lending firms have made the most use of the available government support, followed by insurance intermediaries and brokers, retail investments, and so on, with wholesale financial markets and investment management firms having much lower use of these schemes. And then if we look at in terms of delaying payments, again, this varies significantly across the sectors. So retail lending had the greatest proportion of firms who'd negotiated an extension with creditors or delayed payments. And again, you've got some others, so investment management, retail investments, using these mitigants to a much lesser extent. So in conclusion, I think what we can see is that the impact and the level of preparedness has varied really considerably, both across sectors, but also if you went another layer within this, the firms within the sectors, there's a lot of variation as well. Next slide, please, David. So we've seen many firms meet their responsibilities by planning ahead, ensuring the sound management of their financial resources, improving their wind down plans. We've also had to intervene where this hasn't been the case. We've not seen a material increase in the number of firm failures, and this is primarily due, as I'm sure it's not unexpected, and it's similar to the wider economy, due to the unprecedented levels of government support that are in place to help firms through the pandemic. So as at the first quarter 2021, 31% of the firms that we surveyed had reported furloughing staff, and that's slightly down from the spring of 2020, and 26% of surveyed firms had received a government-backed loan to help them through that period. Again, slightly up from when we looked at spring 2020. And whilst the government support schemes have been extended and the Monetary Policy Committee, their economic outlook has slightly improved, the committee notes that the significant economic uncertainty remains. And so we must be prepared for the prospect of further headwinds once government support is removed. There are some firms which have significant market share and therefore a much greater potential for harm. We quickly set up weekly monitoring of these firms' liquidity positions. And what we saw is, generally speaking, it's those firms who'd been through this type of exercise before, whether on their own initiative or whether through something through with the regulator before, had a better understanding and management of the liquidity risks they were running. For others, it's fair to say this was a steep learning curve and one that had to be learned in a stress situation, which is never ideal. For example, at the start of the pandemic, one of the firms was asked if they had adequate liquidity for the period ahead. And I simplify this a bit, but their response amounted not to too much more than saying they checked their cash balance first thing in the morning, and that's more or less it, not more than that. It's fair to say that isn't the level of assurance we were looking for, but equally, that doesn't help the firm really understanding what may be coming down the track, how they can plan and manage those risks. Thankfully, things have moved on somewhat since then, but it does show the importance of firms understanding the risks and the potential for harm from their activities. And it's been able to monitor these risks on a regular basis and having contingency plans and actions they're actually ready to implement. It's not something that sits there in a big document, in a virtual shelf. It's an action plan that you can implement. So across the population of firms, as I said earlier, we've seen many great examples of firms taking action to mitigate the risks of disorderly failure, whether that's improving their financial resilience, looking at cutting costs, conserving capital, raising capital, looking at different business lines, improving wind down plans, or enhancing their client asset controls. However, as I said before, we've had to intervene where this hasn't been the case for some firms. Go to the next slide, please. So what do we mean by holistic approach to risk management? So we regularly find that some firms tend to think of the elements that feed into the capital planning or liquidity planning as pieces of a puzzle that are separate and standalone, only conducted for capital or liquidity purposes. They have a series of business as usual scenarios. They look at stress testing, look at reverse stress testing, and they have a spaghetti soup of ICAPs, CFPs, WDPs, and all other different acronyms, all separate documents. They're often completed in their silos, and this approach is just such a waste. So for us, scenarios have two purposes. First, to create the playbooks and to train management and departments to react quickly to warnings and efficiently. The second is to check that the indicators have been set are adequate. Can these things happen? How will they materialize? There are three types of scenarios that we're really looking for. What is your business as usual? What do you expect will happen? What is your stress forecast? And equally, what is reverse stressing? There are still far too many firms who in their ICAPs proudly state that they survive all of their reverse stress testing. They are missing this point. If they survive, it usually means the stress assumptions are not severe enough in the first place. The purpose of a reverse stress test is not to show that the firm survives the scenario, but to identify what could make them fail, understand this, then plan the recovery actions. And you need to know, well, when would I need to trigger a wind down plan? And when do I need to be able to do that with enough time to ensure that I can do it in an orderly way? Next slide, please. So to reiterate, and I and many others have said this in other forums, and is very much published, we are not a zero failure regulator. Our focus is ensuring that when firms do fail, they do so in an orderly manner, and it's that harm is minimized. So wind down plans should address liquidity, the operational and the resolution risks. It's also, and I get this question a lot, they need to be proportionate to the size and nature of the firm. I've said before that this is not about having really lengthy documents. They need to be proportionate. If it is fairly straightforward, it can be a fairly straightforward document, but it needs to consider the key risks and then the actions and the planning and the process that needs to take place. Beyond plans for a wind down of an entire business, more robust plans would look at knock-on effects, and they may look at subsets within. So what would be the wind down of certain products, or if you're in a group structure, a subsidiary. And when we look at the wind down plans, again, some of the feedback, common omissions is consideration of communications, whether that's with clients, external stakeholders, a really important part of wind down. Plans should also include realistic triggers. When do you start your wind down? An effective wind down plan will contain both agreed scenarios, but also those triggers, when to set and initiate the wind down plan. We've seen far too many wind down plans that start from a benign position. And I don't know about you, but I've not yet met a board member who choose to wind down from that position. So an adequate plan would therefore assess the lead time associated of the stress scenario playing out, the contingency funding plan actions, and the lead time that those would take until the wind down plan is initiated, and how all of those different components fit together. A board does not wake up one morning and decide to wind down. There is something leading up to that. There is something the firm will do in response, and then there is a trigger of wind down. Likely through that, the financial resilience and the position of the firm will have deteriorated. So it's building all of that into place and joining up those different component parts. So effective plans will ensure that the firm has sufficient warning to take action and be prepared to wind down when the triggers are met. Quite often we see the triggers are hit and then the firm talks about, well, now I want to take some action. Now I want to do my contingency plan. That is eating into those resources that are needed for wind down. So wind down plans should address funding to cover the solvent wind down of a firm, including the return of all customer funds. It's good practice when financial projections are updated, revised, revisited, that they're up to date and accurate also in the wind down planning. And that risk sensitive projections are realistic and take into account the current market environment. For example, we too often see optimistic assumptions in the early months in particular, which have a big impact on the wind down profile. So for example, an unrealistic selling of a business or a book, whilst in stress in the first month, which completely changes then the overall need for liquidity and capital in those early months. A robust wind down plan will also consider all potential costs, so redundancy payments, contract penalties. So whilst no firm sets out to fail, wind down planning is an important part of your toolbox. And when this works well, we've seen firms adapt their business model as they've realized they're not adequately priced the risk of a certain product or business line for stress and wind down and what they would need to do in response to the risks that those business lines contain. Next slide, please. So a contingency funding plan, as I'm sure you are, sets out the firm's strategies for addressing liquidity or funding shortfalls in emergency situations. So tools other than wind down planning should be listed and prepared in your contingency funding plan. The plan sets out firm strategies, it looks at addressing liquidity shortfalls, and it needs to link to the liquidity stress tests. You know, what is the potential need, what could happen, and what are those shortfalls, and how would they be covered? Capital and liquidity buffers, where firms have them, they're there to be used in times of stress. Firms that have been set buffers can use them to support the continuation of firms' activities. That is the point of a buffer. The buffers are there to be used in times of stress. But many firms make the mistake of using capital and liquidity, or thinking about them interchangeably. Just click, please. So for liquidity, generally there are two risks here. First, the inability to obtain funding at a reasonable cost or at all. And the second, the inability to liquidate assets in the necessary time frame at a reasonable price. In other words, you're stressing the contingency funding plan and making sure it's adequate and that the firm understands how long its buffers will last and withstand certain stress or circumstance. As it's in liquidity, this stress is often fast. It can happen quick. So you're looking at hours, it could be intraday, days, could be at most weeks, rather than the months and years that are looked at more frequently in the stress testing side on the capital. So it may take, though, granted some tools will take, could take months before benefits can be felt, like selling assets, real estate, reorganization. But it's how do you get to those, maybe more, the tools that will give you more, how do you bridge through to those? Firms will need to have, therefore, other tools that can be used quickly and effectively, like credit facilities, whether they're overdraft, committed facilities. Be realistic, though, in the assumptions around these tools. Funds that are raised in stress conditions will be much more difficult. And those free daylight facilities, they may be pulled into stress. We've also seen a number of regulated firms have access to a shared group facility. So where the cash is not done on the legal regulated entity, they're part of a group, the group has a committed facility, but they don't know what their share would be. So in stress, would they be able to access the amount they need, or would that be going to other parts of the group? Capital, on the other hand, is there to absorb unexpected losses, which are the residual remaining losses after recoveries. So you still have to survive until those recoveries come in, and your liquidity can help you survive until those recoveries do come in. Next slide, please. So if you take away one thing from today, it's the importance of looking holistically at how your firm manages its risks. As I've said, it's inconceivable that a firm will trigger their wind down plan before doing something to fix the situation, whether that's getting loans, raising capital, taking action on the business model. So it's important to look at the timelines of these different component parts as well. To do this, the firm needs to overlay the stress scenarios to the triggering of the contingency funding plan, then assume the situation gets worse, think about those reverse stress testing scenarios, and then overlay that with the wind down plan. Again, in a case of one firm, we've seen where if you overlay all of these together, the firm not only to go from business as usual straight to wind down, when you looked at the timelines between the reverse stress test and the starting of the wind down, there was a month delay. And that might not seem much, but actually that month meant that the firm had burned through cash much faster than they expected. And actually, when you then came to the wind down, it meant they ran out of cash much earlier than they expected and would not have been able to wind down in an orderly manner. So these elements are not individual pieces of a puzzle, but they're a continuous story. One last point I'll make on scenarios. Many firms look at separate scenarios for credit, market, liquidity, or operational risk. But are you sure there's no secondary credit risks from an operational risk event? Or are there secondary operational risks from your liquidity risks that you should be looking at? There are very few events that are purely one risk. me go to the next slide. So in closing, as I've said, the FCA is the prudential regulator for 49,000 financial services firms. And we want resilient firms who have financial resources that are commensurate to their activities, but also minimize the potential for harm. And that's both in life and in failure. Firms will fail, unfortunately, but firm failure should not be unexpected, and it should be orderly. And it's in conclusion, I say that it's those firms that understand the risk they run and therefore have adequate financial resources are not only less likely to cause harm, but more likely to be successful. We observe a range of practices with liquidity, a particular area of attention, and think about the risks and the harms as part of your business strategy. Reflect that into your thinking, your risk management, and your contingency planning. And last but not least, think of your risk management holistically, not in silos. Thank you for listening. We've placed some links on the slide to the publications that have been referred to within this presentation, and I'll be part of the panelists later on to take your questions. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Dan. I think for an excellent presentation on what is clearly an incredibly important topic, but I think particularly for bringing it to life and being able to talk around that. So actually, I think it makes it much more understandable when it's not just black and white on a page. I did say that we wouldn't take questions during the presentations, but I think there's one I can answer now, which is around will materials be distributed? I believe the answer is yes, but I think Dan might need further approval from within the FCA before being able to do so, if I understand that process correctly. So hopefully we will be able to do that. Okay, so if I now try and hand over to Ariane, which means I've got to find Ariane's presentation, which I saw earlier. You just give me 1 second. And I'm hoping, Ariane, you can now see your slides.
I can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Well, I can see my slide, but not, yeah, that's all right. All good. All good. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So I had the very wide topic of opportunities for operational risk that I turned into opportunity from operational risk. Or ORM, so operational risk management in post-COVID time. So what it's a very broad topic. Oh yeah, sorry, next, I can't move my slide. Next slide, please. So what I want to talk to you about is basically three elements, and for each of these topics or subtopics, I'd like you to participate in the form of a poll. So our first topic will be what COVID has changed in terms of risk management. So again, I'll give you some suggestions from various conversations with various firms I had over the last 15 months, and keen to have your views. Then in terms of anticipation, because risk management is essentially anticipation, you have to summarize in one word. I'd like to see how much you have anticipated the range of the consequences of COVID for your firm. And then to address maybe more specifically the aspect of opportunities for operational risk, I would like to highlight with you the elements of positive risk management. So maybe some of you have heard me talk about that, haven't published about this yet, so this is a long time overdue article of what positive risk management means. So how can we use risk management to enhance the performance of the firm? And then of course I'll be part of the panel discussions. If I can have the next slide, David, please. So probably the most obvious changes to risk management since last year, but please feel free to contradict me during the panel or to add to this list. Risk management was very important to risk manager, always has been, not always to the general public. So risk management has overflown the media for better or worse, we can open that debate as well. It of course highlighted the cost of late intervention, and therefore from a more particular aspect of risk management, the benefits of scenario analysis. And actually, even though we didn't prepare these presentations together, Dan and I mean, or Dan, Simon and I, although I know Simon pretty for a very long time. So, but this presentation, or what I have to say, relates quite well to the need for scenario analysis, stress testing, everything that Dan has highlighted in a cohesive view, and also in a perspective. This is not a painful reporting, because sometimes it is painful from firm, a painful reporting that you have to produce for the regulator, but there is actually a real important, if not crucial, management benefit to run scenario analysis and stress testing, because when you don't, well, we have 2020. And also the flows of what scenario analysis and stress testing can hold, especially if they deny the domino effect, or the, and I'm sure Simon will talk about interrelations as well. This is also one of the main lessons of this crisis, is that you cannot have this pandemic scenario in isolation. You cannot have the considering of any sort of operational risk or financial risk really in isolations, because it's very much a spaghetti dish. Dan mentioned spaghetti, but or I should say maybe a woolen pelote de laine. Sorry, I can't find the name in English now, but basically you pull one trigger and everything goes together. So these interrelations between not only financial risk that everybody knows, but non-financial risk is particularly important. Now, the cost of late intervention, by the flip side, highlights my bullet point number 3, the value of quick reactions and good crisis management. Again, the first speaker talked about having a contingency planning ready to intervene, ready to roll out. And you know, many of you probably know, I work in care highs a lot, and some types of care highs, some types of key risk indicators that really jump to mind now is time to detection. Time to detection, of course, the existence and the speed of a contingency planning in times of great crisis, and of course highlighted the importance of resilience in firms, resilience in processes, operational resilience. It's a massive topic, but also resilience in people. I don't know about you, but yeah, I know, I assume. Let's look around. People are quite stretched out and quite fed up. So they are. I'll try very hard to silence my anticipation, but there is maybe some range of expectations to have on how much you can push people in situations like that, and what would be the consequences if they break, or if too many of them break, and that will be also the second topic of my intervention. And so therefore, you know, well, clearly we were not super prepared. I mean, the financial sector, and I've said that many times in many audios and posts, the financial sector have been arguably quite well prepared compared to other firms. But, you know, overall, it could have been better managed, let's say. So how can we learn the lessons from this time into next time, into the management of next time? Next slides, please. And so this is, David, I will comment the poll just a little bit before you launch it. Sure. So I'm keen to have your views on what you have experienced in your organization. Has it changed your risk management? So has it highlighted the importance of crisis management in scenarios? Do you feel it elevated people risk and cyber risk? Has it brought visibility to the ORM function? And then has it highlighted the strength and vulnerability? So, you know, the good sides and the bad side of your risk management framework and practice. And do you think it will have long-term effects on the way risks are managed? So I think we can launch the poll now, please.
Okay,
And David
launched
will,
the poll.
yeah, we saw the poll. I can't vote, well, which is just as good, but I can't test the
Yes.
voting.
So
Yeah.
maybe have a minute or so if people could.
Yeah, once the number of voters stabilize, I think we can stop the poll in 60
it's going up quite
seconds.
quickly at the moment. We're up to 25% already, which is good.
Wow. Very good.
Um,
And then we'll be able to share the results. These are anonymous results, don't worry. So feel free to click honestly. And
okay, I think
and then
another
comment the
10,
results.
15 seconds. We're up to 60% voting at the moment.
Very good. I lost the screen, so maybe it will come back up.
Yeah,
once the poll
it
is
should
done.
come back.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all right. That happened to me the first time I ran this. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll now. Thank you to everybody. And I will now share the results.
Okay, so highlighted the importance of crisis management in scenarios, 66%. Yes, that's typically, because I've run this poll a few times, last time at Risk Europe. This is very common. I would have anticipated even more than that. Same thing for number 2. Broader visibility of ORM function. Well, that's good. I mean, 1/3 is good. I mentioned at Risk Europe, last time I ran it, we had 0%, which made us laugh a little bit. So good, highlight strengths and weaknesses, 40%, and long-term effect of the way risks are managed, 52%. That's interesting. I would find it encouraging, and so maybe something for the panel to discuss. I don't know, up to you, but how would this long-term effect be? All right, so in the interest of time, I should probably move on. We can stop sharing, and it comes back. Very good. Thank you. So that was basically the first topic. Next slide, please. The other aspect is preparing for the consequences of COVID. So because I wanted to stay neutral, which I'm totally not in real life, but for the interest of this panel, I would split the consequences between optimistic and pessimistic, and you see that the range is very large. But what you think, or what I think is irrelevant from a risk management perspective. From a risk management perspective, what you want is you want to anticipate, and you want to, well, have reasonable anticipation, but you don't want to bet, you don't want to gamble. And so the idea here is, what are the ranges of consequences you can face in the months and years to come, and how you, as operational risk manager or as firms, both senior management and risk management for that matter, can adjust to that. And so I don't need to read the slide out loud, you can see it, but if you're on the optimistic side, you say, well, there's going to be the post-lockdown party on the economic front. So there's going to be a rebound, people will come back to the office, we're going to be so happy and bouncy that there will be an increase of productivity, market demand, more investment, firms hire, although I've heard that firms are hiring now. And so all that will bounce back and will be fine. And also, you've probably heard the speech that what COVID has done and all the disruption it created, it actually accelerated digitalization and accelerated the transformations of firms that were due to become digital and remote to a large extent, and also accelerated these needs for resilience, so all for the better. If you're pessimistic, well, it's basically the opposite of this. We're going to run into an economic recession, then mention also let's brace ourselves for a bunch of bankruptcies when all this economic support will go out. And you didn't say it like that, you said it a lot more politically correct, but I have no one to vouch my speech, so I'll be a bit more blunt. David knows me, that's why he's laughing, he's used to my speech. People will eventually break or continue breaking, so that creates people risk with absenteeism, burnout. Economic recessions means credit defaults. For the operational risk managers around you, well, credit default will highlight boundary events, demand will be sluggish, people risk also materialize in errors and frauds, so elevated operational risk, elevated operational losses. Absentees mean vulnerabilities in operations, And then you also have the complexity of getting back or going back to our old habits of, you know, commuting back to work and talk to actual colleagues, etc., etc. And so the question is, where do we stand? So we can go to the next slide, where is my question to you is not so much whether you're pessimistic or optimistic, because again, our core topic is risk management. So it's more about how have you or have your organization prepared for this range of expectation. So basically you have the choice between no, somewhat, and yes, but I've put in more words to be a bit maybe more intuitive. So not much, I mean, you thought about it, but there's nothing real actions or consequences from a risk management or a management perspective that took place in your organization, or you've started now, the process has started, it's not complete yet, but it's somewhat already being framed, or actually you have thought about it, you had discussions about this, and contingency actions or you know, alternative plans depending on what takes place, and you feel quite well prepared. So I think, David, we can launch the poll now, please.
Okay, poll should now be open. So again, if you could please vote. It's only one option this time. And again, I can see we're up to 30-odd% in the first 10-15 seconds. I feel a bit like I'm commentating on a racehorse where no one can actually see the runners and the riders, but never mind. We'll get there soon. Okay, already up to 60% have voted, which is where we got to last time. Again, just to, as Ariane mentioned, this is completely anonymous, so Dan isn't going to come knocking on your door based on how you're answering this.
Now you stressed out everybody, you realize.
I did, sorry about that.
That's okay. How's the percentage going now?
Yeah, I think we're about stabilized at about 70%, so I'm going to close that now.
We can claim it's representative.
Yeah, and I will share and find out how much trouble I'm in later.
All right. So I don't know if the FCA member on the panel, but 50% have started, 9% are honest or unprepared or both, and 41% feel quite well prepared. So 90% have at least kickstart the process, which is excellent. So I'm happy to discuss or to hear more about this on the panel. Thank you very much, guys. We can move on to the third and last topic for today, which is also in three. You know, consultants always work in three sections, three subsections, etc. So positive risk management here is something I'd like to push, and I've started pushing at the end of my book 2 years ago, in highlighting how can we concentrate more on the efficiency gain and on the upside of risk management. And the IRM, in fairness, following ISO for so many years, I used to be a trainer for the IRM, gosh, over 10 years ago now, I think. A focus on risk is an opportunity. So they basically, risk is two-sided. You can lose, but you can also gain. And operational risk managers are for a very long time concentrated more on the downside. But of course, it's not very uplifting when you talk to people around avoiding losses and, you know, the risk of avoiding something negative. And so you can flip this around by focusing on the upside. And there's three ways here, just for the sake of, I guess, simplifications of the concept I've highlighted in this upside. One is to acknowledge the revenues and opportunity cost of overtaking risk and undertaking risk. I have 3 slides that details that, but I'm going to just summarize it now. That's one aspect. Another aspect is learning from success and positive outliers. And to me, genius mind, or brilliant mind at least, that attract my attention to it, that you might know is a brilliant essay writer, Malcolm Gladwell, that has written a book, Outliers. Mind you, there's been tons of self-help books in the 80s about, you know, the key lessons of the successful people, 5 rules of successful communicators, managers, best CEO, blah, blah, blah. But you can really use this reasoning as well for operational risk, and rather than only analyzing losses and again, those who follow me know I'm a big fan of root cause analysis and bow tie and dig into the why and the why of the why and the cause of the cause of the causes of incidents. Arguably, you can do the same with your success, especially or in particular, because that's we're talking about operational risk, your operational success, you know, projects that went well, clients that at least initially complain and then turn out to be happy, etc. And so you do bow tie analysis, but you do bow tie analysis on success. So you share the success rather than only the mistakes. And the other, I've changed it to a more running examples or speed example, but also at the IRM in the foundations of risk management, there's a parallel that the Institute of Risk Management used, the parallel of risk management in brakes of cars. You know, cars, brakes allow cars to stop when they need to, but also allow them to go faster because you can rely on good brakes. And here the idea is you can rely on good risk management to improve the performance of the business, and the more complicated your goals, the more important your risk management. So just very quickly, the different slides, please, if we can go to the next one, just to elaborate a little bit on and to be a bit more technical also on what I'm saying. So just to take another well-used parallel of the iceberg, in operational risk, you can look at the operational losses per se, so the direct loss, the observable loss, the equivalent of the immersed part of the iceberg, while the part underwater are the revenue not earned because you had an incident and the client not only leave you, but you have bad referrals. So that's a whole reputation risk that everybody talks about, but almost no one measures. So that's my other, at the firm, another stream of research that we've kickstarted with a PhD student. But also revenue not earned because you're too slow, because you're ineffective. And either you're ineffective, and that's the lines, the bullet points behind, you're ineffective or you're suboptimal in terms of efficiency because you're over control, you're too slow, you're undertaking risks, or, and I've seen both firms, I've been training and consulting for both types of firms, or the firms that are overtaking risks or they're disorganized, their processes are not great, let's say, and they keep having errors and they keep remediating incidents and waste time like this. So in terms of measurement, and cost of controls and benefits of risk management, we really encourage you to go beyond what meets the eyes and try to look at loss of performance. Next slide, please. I've commented a lot these slides, but just to show you, well, my emoji, according to my kids that are all pretty teenager, one is adult and another are twins. I'm so lame, I never passed the emoji state, sorry. But what I want to attract your attention about is the information that also lies in positive outliers. And I don't have, for sake of time, I don't have lots of slides on this, but in other presentation, I talk about the flow of using averages in risk management and rather look at the max and the mins. Oops, something exploded on the slide presentation. That's okay. And so try to extract information in your extremes, in your data. We can go to the next slide. We lost the full screen view, but that's okay. And so the measurement is demonstrating the value of risk management is A, very powerful to gain buy-in, and B, possible not only by comparing trends and look at your peers, which is necessary, but also to capture this upside of performance and efficiency is really to tie operational risk management with performance management by looking at what I call here the robustness of outcomes, so which is the outcome of project management. Are your projects on time, on budget, or let's say not too much over budget and not too much delayed, because otherwise it's very naive. What are the results of your investments decisions, and how well are you how good are you at achieving your objectives, because there is an undeniable, I think, tie between performance management and risk management. Next slide, please. I think we are, so this is just the illustration of Usain Bolt. I presented this at my kids' school. They all knew who it was. It was a few years ago. But if you want to be a world champion, and here I'm talking more in the financial services, the leader in your field, whatever your field is, you really don't want to mess up. And if you really don't want to mess up, you need to be on the goal, you know, on the ball, and anticipate and see it coming, and really control whatever can derail you for your objective and maintain the aim comes from the military. I think we get to the poll now. So having said that, I've biased this poll. I probably could have started with this, but at least you had the voiceover. So very quickly, in your firms, do you do some of it or all of it? So do you consider cost of controls before or establish or removing a control with the cost of risk-taking? So the cost of risk-taking being possible incidents. And then maybe a bit more measurable than that is option 2. Do you actually include the loss of future events in the cost or benefit of operational risk incidents? So I'm not talking about reporting to the FCA or reporting for standardized approach, etc., but in your management value of operational risk incidents. When I say benefit of operational risk incidents, that's very much the loss acceptance. What COSO talks about the acceptable variations of performance, because if you have a high-speed strategy, you have to be able to let things drop as well, but that needs to be explained and communicated to the regulator. Do you celebrate success? Do you learn from positive outliers? I realize I'm over time, so I need to stop very soon. And do you measure the impact of risk management beyond the measure of loss events? So let's launch the poll, and so that will be it for me after that.
Okay, again, so if you could select multiple choices here that apply. And apologies to Ariane on the slides. It's like my first driving test. It was all going very well, then I got a bit confident, and things went horribly wrong after that for a while. But I did pass the second time. Okay, I think it's taking people a little longer to vote this time, I think, as they take in the actual meaning of the questions, which is good. And I think, if possible, Ariane, if you've got a couple more minutes, that would be great.
I'll have to apologize to Simon.
No, it's okay. I left some contingency in there for him, so he should be okay. So we're up to about 50% voting in the minute, so that's about static now.
Let's leave it another 30 seconds, maybe. Oh, wait. No,
sorry.
Or not?
Yeah, I got carried away.
All right, so lowest response, this number 2. Yeah, so basically, except the first one, a majority of people do not do celebrating success. Well, almost half of them celebrating success. Learn from a positive outlier is 38. Include cost of revenues in. All right, well, thank you very much. I won't comment. I'll take questions if you need during the panel, but I think we can move on to the next topic. Thank you very much, and apologies for the 5 minutes delay, or not. I'm not sure. Or bang on time. You said 55 at the latest.
No, you're bang on time.
Sorry, Simon.
Okay.
It's no problem.
So
I like Paul.
Yeah. So Simon, I'm now going to try and hand control to you in another first for me.
No problem at all. Yeah, I'm a very bad co-driver. I like to be in control.
That's fine. Or you heard my reputation before we started. Hopefully, have you got control now? Yes.
I do. I think people are probably seeing us now, so I shall. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. All clear?
Yeah, that's fine.
That's good. So good afternoon, everybody. my purpose today is really twofold. One is to talk about old risks in new clothes, and I'll come on to explain that in a moment. And secondly, to stress the importance of the of IOR, IRM sound practice guidance papers in this, and the importance of competency and also diversity of competency as well when it comes to dealing with old risks in new clothes. What do I mean by that? Well, of course, pandemics. We're living through the COVID-19 pandemic at the moment. It's not the first pandemic. I went on to kind of Wikipedia, to sort of have a look, and of course there are hundreds, if not thousands, of historical pandemics dating kind of, back to before kind of biblical times. And of course, we won't remember it, but we may have grandparents or we have kind of relatives that maybe did live through the flu pandemic of 1918-19, called of course the Spanish flu, because Spain was one of the few countries to actually report on that particular pandemic. Many countries, including the UK, had a kind of media blackout on it because they didn't want people to panic. Now, of course, there was no social distancing in those days, and it's estimated that about 500 million people were infected and around 50 million people died as a result. So kind of huge numbers affected by that particular pandemic. And of course, fast forward, many of us, of course, were operational risk managers in kind of the mid 2000s, 2002, 2004, and of course we lived through the SARS pandemic, and there was much talk. That was probably the first time myself as a risk professional started thinking about pandemic risk and preparing for pandemic risk in the light of course, that pandemic. Of course, in those days, the idea of national lockdowns, the idea of economies effectively being stopped for a year or more was just not something that entered into my consciousness or entered into my thinking. And even last March, I suspect many of us were in a similar situation. I can remember myself thinking that this particular pandemic would be over very soon, and even stating confidently to colleagues in Belgium that the UK and its libertarian government would of course never have a lockdown, and we'd just be carrying on with our normal lives. Of course, that was that illusion was very quickly kind of shattered, and we all found ourselves living in lockdown, and my wife and I spending most of our days trying to find yeast, toilet paper and park-baked baguettes for our kind of elderly neighbours, all of whom were suddenly self-isolating as a result of the pandemic. So a very fast, of course, learning curve for many of us. And as I said, pandemics are nothing new. COVID-19 was, I think, very much to be expected. It's not really a surprise that the world is experiencing another pandemic like that, many hundreds as it's experienced in the past. What's changed is we're in a new world, and we're in a world of what's been called a transboundary crisis. These are crises that cross borders. Of course, in pandemics, they cross geographical borders, but transboundary crises cross more borders than that. They cross from the natural world into the economic world, into the world of politics, into the kind of our social lives, and so on. This, of course, is the Icelandic, don't ask me to pronounce it, the Icelandic volcano, of course, that erupted, and the volcanic ash cloud that was there, and of course that caused major disruption for airline travel, and people were stranded in countries for some number of days. Of course, again, really pales into insignificance compared to the travel disruption caused by COVID-19, but this is one of the first examples of a transboundary crisis. We've had, of course, things like the Fukushima earthquake and the impact on the nuclear station there. We've had things like the global financial crisis. We've had immigration crises, all sorts of crises again, established risks, old risks in new clothes that have far greater impacts than they ever did before. And this is just some of the features of a transboundary crisis. They cross domains. In the case, of course, of COVID-19, it's moved from the natural world very much into our economics, into our social lives, into financial markets. Of course, financial markets were very much impacted and continue to be impacted both positively and negatively by the virus. These old risks, these familiar risks, do seem to suddenly change from the familiar into something very new and something very different, as of course we saw with COVID-19. In the space of just a few really days, in March, we went from watching it on the TV in China to suddenly living through it ourselves. And of course, many businesses went from assuming that 2020 would be a normal year to suddenly having to deal with how our staff were going to work from home, how in my case, how are we going to educate? How are we going to continue to run university courses, for example, and moving on to working at home, working online, Zoom, and so on and so forth. These crises also seem to be very uncertain. This, of course, was a fact with COVID-19. There was extreme levels of uncertainty about the nature of the virus, how infectious it was, how deadly it was. Then there was a lot of uncertainty about the impacts on business, the impacts on economics, and of course, there's continued uncertainty around the different kind of virus strains that seem to be emerging. Lots of people impacted. It's not just a government problem. It's not just a business problem. It's not just a household problem. It's something that it impacts on everybody and has a kind of universal effect. And of course, there are no easy solutions to these things. No easy solutions for governments who have to kind of trade off health. Well, let's be honest, have to trade off short-term health of people versus kind of economic health, which of course will ultimately translate into people's long-term health as well, because of course there's a link between poverty and economics there. But very difficult decisions being made, and of course very difficult decisions for businesses as well, how to continue to operate, how to coordinate their activities and so on. So we're in this world now of transboundary crises. COVID-19 is just one of a series of crises that we've experienced pretty much since the turn of the century, and it's likely that we're going to experience more. This isn't the last kind of pandemic, and I don't just mean pandemic in terms of virus pandemic. We're going to continue, and organizations are going to continue to experience these transboundary crises, and they're going to continue to encounter old risks in new clothes and have to suddenly fundamentally change how they think, how they operate. Now, how do you cope with this? How do you deal with this? Well, I think one of the first things I would say is that kind of risk intelligence is really what it's all about. It's about people's skills, knowledge, training, and it's about also having diversity in their skills, knowledge, training, education, and so on and so forth. The picture on the right-hand side is from a film called World War Z. I'm a big fan of kind of science fiction and dystopian type things, zombie movies and all that kind of stuff. And World War Z was very interesting because it had something called, because Israel was one of the few places not overrun by the zombie apocalypse. And in the film, this was because they had something called the 10th man. I'm afraid it was man, but the 10th man principle. And the idea was that there was a ruling council of 10. If all of them believed in something was the case, then it was the duty of the 10th man to play devil's advocate, to have a kind of opposite view. And the idea was it was introduced this as a safeguard against complacency, to safeguard against kind of hubris, overconfidence, and a belief that the world is perhaps safer than it actually is. And because of this 10th man principle, and because of the kind of devil advocate role played by that individual, Israel was able to withstand, at least for a time, the zombie apocalypse. And risk intelligence is really an extension of that. What it's saying is that what you don't want is everybody in the organization thinking the same way. You need some diversity. but you need that diversity rooted in people's technical competencies and also in their people skills. So unsurprisingly, of course, sound practice is really key here, and I hope in one positive, Ariane very rightly talked about positive risk management. I'm a great believer in that as well, and I'm a great believer that even in the most adverse environments, there's always an opportunity to learn and an opportunity to do better next time. So I hope that many of you take this opportunity to reacquaint yourselves with the IOR sound practice guidance papers, that you build your technical competency, and that also you build your people skills too. And of course, these guidance papers cover many of the topics that we've been talking about today: KRIs, scenarios, culture, risk appetite, and so on. Now, how does that fit in terms of really dealing with these transboundary crises? Well, success in the modern world when it comes to dealing with these old risks in new clothes, success really comes developing skills in a number of areas. Firstly, you need formal skills, of course, and formal competency. We've talked about scenario analysis and capital planning, and we talk about risk reporting, so it's kind of formal structures in organizations. But you should never forget the informal side as well, how embedded risk management is, effectiveness of leadership, effectiveness, of course, of your risk culture, and also how well you learn as an organization too. So you need that blend of formal and informal, and of course the sound practice guidance papers very much reflect that. But you also need, and Ariane was right to say, a lot of risk management's about anticipation, planning, planning for the future using things like scenario analysis. But of course, good operational resilience also requires adaptation as well. It requires us to accept that things don't always go quite as we expect, especially when we're dealing with things like transboundary crises. So sometimes we do need to kind of relearn or unlearn what we thought we knew about a particular scenario, a particular situation, and adapt to the environment that we find ourselves in. So adaptation is also a very key part of that, embodying, as I say, these kind of skills, elements of preparedness, responsiveness, embedding, but also the kind of soft side, things like quality of leadership, risk culture of the organization, and so on. I encourage you to reflect on this. How well are you as an organization? How well are you at planning, but also how well are you at adapting? When things don't quite go as planned, how do you respond as an organization? Do you stick your head in the sand and pretend that nothing has happened? Do you, kind of freeze like a rabbit in headlights? Or do you take action? Do you go, look, this is not quite as I expected, but we can still cope with this, we can still learn from this, we can still potentially do things differently. I'm aware that I need to finish very soon. So I'll just bring in my kind of final thing to encourage you to think about, trying to bring all of this together, particularly the importance of technical competency. Now, there's a temptation, I think, when we're faced with a new and uncertain situation like COVID, there's a tendency sometimes to think fast. We let our emotions, we let our intuition perhaps dominate more than we should do, and that can lead to flawed decisions. The rabbit in headlights, the ostrich in the sand, or a range of other kind of suboptimal, irrational responses to situations. And I think we've all seen probably a lot of irrational responses, both amongst businesses and people and governments when it comes to COVID-19. What we need to do, and this is the importance of getting people kind of competent and building their technical knowledge as well as their soft skills. What we need to do is improve training, education, and experience to encourage what Daniel Kahneman calls slow thinking. Now, slow thinking is not slow in the sense that it takes ages to reach a decision, far from it. Slow thinking is just more deliberate, more logical, more not quite rational. I'm not trying to say that there's a difference between rational and irrational here, but it's just more considered, more reflective decision making. Not going to talk in detail about this particular case. My slides most certainly can be shared, but I do invite you to have a look at the case of HEB Supermarkets. It's a Texas supermarket chain. January last year, HEB was looking at the pandemic, was looking at how Chinese supermarkets were coping and responding to the pandemic, and was already making changes to its supply chains, already making changes to its stores, so that it could cope with the pandemic. So, you know, when certain perhaps American politicians, without naming names, were saying it's not going to be a problem here, it's a Chinese problem and all the rest of it, this particular Texas supermarket was already responding and making sure that it learned from the experience of others. So it's a great case, and though it's not financial services, I think it's certainly one that we all need to bear in mind. And it very much emphasizes the importance of planning, but also the importance of adaptation, along with formal and informal capabilities when it comes to dealing with risk. So it's time, of course, now for the panel. If you want to get in touch to discuss anything that you've seen, please do get in touch with me at Vlerick Business School. Not that I'm, of course, there at the moment. Belgium's still under kind of partial lockdown, but do please get in touch, and I'd love to discuss it with you more. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Again, another, I think, together with you, Ariane and Dan, incredibly engaging presentation. And if I dare say, I think they've all been very human presentations, which makes a big difference. People can relate to those. I also never thought I'd hear a zombie apocalypse being used as an example on how to avoid grief. But
a lot we can learn from zombie apocalypses.
There is.
I loved it. I loved it. You must have been watching that film and thought, I can apply this to risk. But
yeah, it certainly sticks in the mind.
Very good.
So we've had several questions come in, and I'll try and get through those questions. Obviously, I've got many of my own, but let's try and stick to the panelists if we can. Probably the first two I'm going to come to you with, Dan, just to prepare you. So the first one is saying, Dan, great presentation. We struggle to get RMC members and NEDs to really drive the right questions. Other than events like this, is there any meta-analysis from the Section 166 that would help drive behaviours without naming names? Fines drive behaviours as they're public, but a hard piece of analysis would really help. Any plans?
Yeah. So look, if I take that more broadly first, that I recognise, I imagine lots of people on this call, you know, are practitioners, and part of this is the how do you influence within your firm. I think that's a really important point first off. So look, I think use things like this. I completely agree. I would point to those other sources. I mean, you know, we did publish that guidance around adequate financial resources. Now again, it sort of goes across the key bits. But I do think, you know, it's really important. It's striking whilst the iron is hot. This is in people's minds at the moment. So now is the opportunity. I agree. Things do quickly move on. So we might not be there yet, but they suddenly do. They pick up pace. I always find it fascinating from the last financial crisis how little time it suddenly took to some people who had very short memory. So I agree with that. On the specific point, we don't have any current plans on the Section 166s, but there's something I can take away, and I think open to suggestions about how we can help. There were some, and I think you can find them still. We did a NEDS sort of roundtable series of those a few years ago, and you can still search for them. I think if you do FCA NED roundtable, again, it might, because it's got NEDs on there, it might just help them. And it goes through some of the points, particularly around liquidity, stress testing, wind down. I'd use those if you wanted to focus the minds about, look, the regulator has said a few years ago, I've just been to a presentation and they're talking about the same things and how it's played out. We need to be prepared.
Ariane, Simon, anything you want to add? So
all fine.
Okay. the next question, Dan, brings in the dreaded phrase of operational resilience. But you knew this was going to come up. It had to. So on financial resilience and holistic risk management, I'm interested to understand if there is any consideration of synergies and alignments between the financial resilience and operational resilience rules that are being proposed, or are these expected to run in their own right?
Yeah, great question, and it's one of those things. Wherever you cut these things, there's angles, right? So I come back to the principle is, you need to think about them holistically and where they map. I mean, it may be if I look at where we are on specific rules, and we look at the moment, we've got certain ones for financial resilience, we have certain things and expectation about operation resilience, but we've got lots of subcomponents within those. So I still think for me it's mindset rather than rules, because whatever way we look at cutting things, there's always a silo somewhere. For me, it's mindset, joining them up. It's about thinking about them as consistent, as holistic principles, and where are those interplays? Where are we thinking about this is an operational risk, but actually we need to think about resilience. That's something we do within the regulator when we think about firms. Where's that interplay? I think you need to be thinking about where's this a capital event? Whereas quite often, when we talk about operational resilience, it's not about the money. It's about, because the money's not going to get you up and live and running again. It's about the service, and you need to get going again. So, but thinking about ultimately that may cost you. It may then come back to an operational risk. You may lose clients, blah, blah, blah. So I think you need to think about the end-to-end process, and that's how we do. I think by nature, we tend to then go into depth in topics and go deeper and deeper into it. I think that's what we've got in some of our guidance, but equally within firms. But it's about that bringing it back, how do they join up, where are the linkages?
Okay.
There's one thing I just add there, and for me, when I think about, if you like, resistance compared to resilience, is, resilience isn't necessarily about bouncing back. So it's not necessarily about going back to where you were. It's about bouncing forward. So it's about exploiting the situation, and as Ariane was talking previously about finding opportunities, finding ways to do things differently. And I think there's many opportunities for financial services from the pandemic, whether it's about, of course, getting rid of cash, which is a pain in everyone's kind of backside, or whether it's about more automation, for example, and so on. So it's about thinking about what are those opportunities? How can we exploit the new normal that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, Ariane, this isn't one of the questions from the attendees, but maybe just picking up on those first two topics, and then you're looking at kind of positive risk management and maybe how people can move forward. What are you seeing? Where are you seeing improvements in frameworks and interconnectedness and maybe holistic risk management?
Well, I mean, first of all, I completely agree with the bouncing forward, and so it's a good phrase too. So that's fine. Look, honestly, but I'm like a doctor, right? Firms don't call me when they go particularly well. They call me when they're not doing so well. So I can't say that I've seen amazing improvement yet. However, I'm very happy that scenario analysis and risk interconnections, which is two topics I was very vocal about and I care about, are put forward. And to Dan's comment on the operational resilience versus the financial resilience, again, as much as you can tie them together and explain economies of scale and scope and how you can use one to reinforce the other, that would be economical and efficient for firms as well. So I really would relate to that. Yes.
Okay, and maybe just on that topic of scenario analysis, and I agree, it's an incredibly important topic, and I know it's something you're all passionate about. Mm-hmm. One of the questions is, I'll say, in such scenarios, which sort of risk management is more effective, financial or enterprise?
I would say it depends on the scenario. Yeah. That's pretty an obvious answer, yeah. Isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you have a credit recession, again, before doing operational risk, I'm an economist by training, and I'm a credit risk manager before being an operational risk manager. So Of course, a tsunami, or sorry, I said I wouldn't. the potential credit default that we have seen, will see, might see, is very much a credit crisis. So I would say the first response is manage your collateral, clear out your boundary events, adjust your, also from an ERM perspective, adjust your risk appetite to credit losses. But also, of course, and that's more the financial risk management of credit risk. But of course, linked to that, because we're talking about interconnectedness of risks, people risks that everybody, I mean, that lots of people anticipate to be heavy, needs to be tied up. So how do I streamline, organize my credit allocation process, my credit review process, in order to manage my credit risk most efficiently? That would be one example, but maybe other panelists wants to comment.
Yeah, so I'm agreed. It depends, and it's thinking about things in the round to sort of repeat. But I mean, even if you just took, I was going to share an example around when looking at a firm we'd assessed and how they approached financial risk. And so one firm, same risk, one firm had approached it in a 1 in 50 stress situation, and one in 200. But actually the 1 in 50 was much better because of the whole way they thought about it and processed it, even though the number. So again, I think it's not as simple as just looking at the numbers, because even with the numbers, it's the inputs and how that's done and what that leads to and how it fits in with everything else.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we've learned from the pandemic is that we need planned, formal mechanisms like capital. I mean, fundamentally, that's Slack. It's having Slack. It's stockpiles of masks, stockpiles of money. I mean, to some extent, it's the same thing. You need that Slack, and businesses that have had those stockpiles have done better during the pandemic. So you need that, but you also need to be prepared for the unexpected. So you have that kind of pre-prepared response, but then you learn when to deviate from that response as well. So you kind of need both.
And it's sort of,
sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
And it's playing into the business model, because I think you can really see we've got such a wide variety that the different sectors. Some do have a bit more time. Some of them have got more contractual flows that will give you a little bit of time. So as long as you know that, then you've got a slightly different plan in terms of your stockpile and what you're going to get to it. But there's others who it takes no time at all, and therefore you do need to think about this is a sudden event. And so again, the business model really plays out fundamentally to how you need to manage those risks in advance, and then how quickly they could then materialize.
Yeah, picking up of what has been said, because that's something I'd like to highlight. What I observe consistently across firms is that most of them resent scenario analysis because they see it as a complicated calculation exercise, and the 1 in 200 or 1 in 1,000. It doesn't have to be. I mean, the value of scenario analysis is management first, and Andrew published on our website on that as well. So it needs to be a management lesson. The calculation will come after. If you have a sound script, and it's like the equivalent of what Dan just said about 1 in 50, because they thought about incidents. So tying up to a story first without worrying about modeling, and pluck some simple numbers after, simply calculated numbers after that is a lot healthier. Simon seems.
I've got one.
Yeah.
I got one more again. It might link a little bit back as I'm thinking to that first question about how do you convince your NEDs, because it's sort of, that's what Ariane was just saying, sparks into that. But I remember we were presented this ICAP. It was fantastic. Now it really improved, and this was so much better risk management. And ultimately, though, it was a much lower capital number, and that's fine. So it can be better and lower, but it was all about the op risk model, basically. So everything that had moved the dial was in the op risk model. So you ask the question to the NEDs, what's happened in the model, and none of them knew. So again, they had these hundreds of pages and all this, and there's some really good work, but fundamentally, they didn't understand the key bit, which was something had changed in the model, and it hadn't picked up that really important point. And I think, again, it's that standing back. Why has the number gone down? That could be perfectly plausible, and in many cases good. It's better risk management. But if you don't understand why and don't challenge why, then it's just a model, and you've not picked it up.
That's a great example of thinking slow, actually, sort of stepping back and going, hang on a sec, how do I need to assess this? How do I need to evaluate this? Don't take it at face value.
Thanks. I'm conscious we've got 3-4 minutes left. I think we could probably talk for hours. And I really hope we could reconvene somehow at some point. Just quickly though, there's one specific question that's coming down about the contingency funding plan. So obtaining funding at a reasonable cost, first step. Second step, liquidate assets at a reasonable price. And then it's saying, my question is, what about the timing? In my opinion, the consideration around timing should be in there as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Sorry, and I should just clarify, they were not concrete steps, they were examples, illustrative of the things. And yes, of course, the timing, it's just that these are the sorts of things to be thinking about. And I also completely agree, the timing will differ between your contingency funding plan. Some things can happen quicker, some's later. The important thing is understanding all of the different actions and the timing and the risks around them and how available they will be. So it's fine to include something, but you might understand that in stress that might not be available and actually might be less plausible. It's understanding all those dynamics.
Okay. Just a quick plug from me for the IOR IRM, which is in response to a question. Some people are asking, when will other chapters be opened up? So anybody who's interested in that, if they could contact me, my email will be on the material, and you can probably find me on LinkedIn as well. And it's something actually we're thinking about at the moment. The final question is something of a philosophical question. And so Simon, if I can come to you with your zombie head on.
Sure.
So the precautionary principle has dominated the response to COVID by many governments. Do you believe the precautionary principle is a sensible basis for approaching uncertainty?
Ariane's smiling. I mean,
Yes.
I'm not going to remain neutral. No, I don't. I think the precautionary principle actually can cause more trouble than it's worth. We've managed the immediate consequences of this pandemic, but we pretty much ignored the long-term consequences. We've made people poorer, we've ruined businesses, and I think, you know, we're going to be dealing with the aftermath of this for many years to come. You know, it's the whole kind of word safe. There's no such thing as safe. We just have to manage risk within acceptable parameters, and we have not yet had a sensible discussion about what is acceptable parameters for risk in this context. And again, it comes back to really thinking slow and reflecting on the situation. So personally, and I want to stress this is very much a personal opinion, no, I don't think it's very sensible, because I think you create other problems out of that particular problem. But that's a personal perspective.
Last 60 seconds, any other comments on that?
Oh, I cannot agree more. I mean, I tried very hard to be neutral on this, but I cannot agree more with Simon. I think we're going to deal with this for many years, if not decades to come. I think we're going to be in history books for the most aberrant risk management value of a crisis. But there you go. I said I'd have my opinion, but I couldn't on this one.
Thank you. So if I can just thank all three of you, I think you've been tremendous. I've really enjoyed this event. It's the first one I've hosted like this, and I've made it to the end, so I'm more than happy at the moment. Just on IOR, IRM, please have a look at the website. There is a certificate in operational risk management, which is a formal qualification that's becoming more and more recognized, and I think can have great benefit to the people taking it, and also to businesses. And also, as Simon has mentioned, about the good practice guides, although I know I got the name wrong, but you know what I mean. So on that, if I can just say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.